What will an ant do if it finds itself far from the anthill? I often asked myself that question as a child. For example, if it ended up on a boat and landed on the other shore, or if it's traveled in a car hundreds of kilometers away from its home, will it spend the rest of its life for searching the anthill? Since childhood, I vividly remember the cartoon Travel of an Ant, where the main character, blown far away from his anthill by the wind, makes his way back home on caterpillars, spiders, and grasshoppers, as if hitchhiking. In reality, however, they rely only on their own mechanisms to find their way back home. These mechanisms can vary significantly among different species, and there are about 15,000. But in any case, the range of these mechanisms is limited, tens or to hundreds of meters. Once outside this range, the ant becomes disoriented, like a child lost in unfamiliar city. For example, many ants move along scent trails marked by pheromones, special substance they secrete from various glands on their abdomen. The more ants travel along a particular road, the more pheromones they leave behind. An ant only needs to stumble upon one of these trails, and from there it can follow it like a rail back home. The existence of these navigation mechanisms was first deduced by Swiss naturalist Charles Bonner, who lived in the 18th century. He ran his finger across an ant trail and then observed how ants gathered on both sides of the invisible line, hesitating to cross it. You can draw a path of any shape and ants will try to follow it, keeping it between their antennae, like a trolley following wires. This way, you can make them zigzag along a dotted line or curve. In fact, you can control an entire colony behavior by using their pheromones. Of course, there is so much you can tell ants with pheromones, but ants don't need much, just where the food is and how to get there. Now, how can we get ants to solve the travel salesman problem? All you need is a simple bottle of sweet syrup. The instructions are easy. Find an anthill and place 10 drops of syrup in the desired locations. The first ant senses the food and follows the trail, marking it as it goes along, returning to the anthill after visiting each drop. Then others follow its path, but each one tries to cut a bit of the road, making the path slightly shorter each time. After that, the universal ant rule kicks in. If you sense a pheromone trail, there is no need to think. Just follow it. The simple instinct in every ant's mind drives the gear of an entire anthill. The longer the trail, the less often it's traveled, and it evaporates more quickly. Meanwhile, the shorter the path, the more often ants travel along it, continuously refreshing the scent until it fills the entire forest. In the end, only the strongest, shortest path remain, just like the footpaths people create by frequently walking over them, while longer, less used paths grow over with grass. By the way, do you know how many pheromones an ant has? 2, 3, 1,000? Around 20. Some triggers food researches, others social bonding, and third, burial processes. Wait, burial processes? Yes, when an ant dies, no one pays attention to it for the first 2 days. Only when it starts decomposing, other ants carry it to the ant cemetery. Ants ignore their dead comrade because they don't have awareness. They navigate solely by pheromones, so they simply don't see the ant. But as soon as it starts to smell, they initiate the burial process. From a human perspective, it's like taking the trash out when it starts to smell. If you drop a bit of pheromone on a living ant, it will walk itself to the cemetery and start to bury itself. And as soon as the smell fades, the zombie rises from the grave, dusts itself off, and goes back to the colony as if nothing happened. No question asked as to why it came back from the dead. Interesting, but there are also pheromones that make them gather into a mega structure. Bring the kids over to the screen for a wow moment. What's in this bucket isn't soil or compost, it's a massive clump of ants. Escaping from water, they lock legs, forming a mass that looks like clay. You can mold it like a ball, squeeze it like a spring, and if you try to pull it apart, it resists. In nature, ants survive floats by forming these huge living rafts and floating together for up to 2 weeks until they reach safety. They don't even suffocate because of tiny air bubbles from between them. Ants can also gather into a massive breach to swarm something big, like a wasp nest that gets in their way. One-on-one, an ant would obviously lose to a wasp, but a colony could take down 1,000 wasps. And when you'll hear this next fact, you'll understand why they are called a colony. When Europeans colonized America, they unknowingly brought along some new passengers, Argentine ants. These ants encountered almost no competition and quickly spread, first through Europe and then around the world. If you were to take an Argentine ant from Japan, Spain and New Zealand today, they would recognize each other by scent and not fight because they're all part of one global super colony. Simple algorithms have allowed ants to survive virtually in any conditions for millions of years. It's interesting to consider what will happen if these mechanisms will fall apart. For example, if one ant makes a mistake and takes a detour, then another follows the same trail and also starts to wander in circles, and other ants come along the same trail. Thus, a vicious circle of errors accumulates, leading to thousands of individuals merging into a massive ant mill while they die from exhaustion. If we believe the notes of naturalist William Beebe in Guyana, he observed an ant mill with a diameter of 370 meters. Pheromone trails are especially important for ants with poor vision or for those that are completely blind, such as South American army ant. Huge columns of these ants, consisting of hundreds of thousands of individuals, move through the tropical forest in search of prey, destroying everything in their path. They don't have a permanent nest, only temporary bivouacs. They seem to defy the well-known saying that if a blind man leads the blind man, they will fall into a pit. However, if an ant finds itself outside its familiar visual landscape, it will likely never find its way back home. This was demonstrated in an experiment with ants that live in Australia. During the experiment, scientists cut down 3 trees near the path that these ants used to travel from their nest to hunt. The general outline of the canopy is changed, though not drastically. Nevertheless, right after the trees were cut, the ants started wandering more and hesitating, instead of heading directly to their usual hunting grounds. It took 3 days for the ants to adjust to the altered landscape. Now imagine if one of them were suddenly placed in a completely unfamiliar environment. It's doubtful it will be able to find its way back. To choose the right direction, some ants not only rely on the surroundings but also looks to the sky. This was first demonstrated in 1911 by Swiss entomologist Felix Satsky, who experimented with ants in North Africa. When the ants were returning to their nest, Satsky blocked the sun and simultaneously showed its reflection in a mirror. The simple trick was enough to throw the ants off course and direct them in opposite direction. The sun and polarized light play a particular crucial role in the lives of desert ants, as they live in a flat and ever-changing landscape where large terrestrial landmarks are almost non-existent. But even for them, the sky alone is not enough. To determine the location of their nest, ants always need some additional information. In this regard, desert runner ants, true masters of navigation studied by a generation of scientists, are especially noteworthy. These ants race across the scorching sand at incredible speed, up to 1 meter per second, searching for insects that have died from the heat. They always hunt alone and do not leave pheromone trails. Nevertheless, a runner ant, which can stray more than 150 meters from its nest while searching for prey, which is about 40 kilometers for a human, returns along a straight path. These ants construct its return route by tracking the trajectory it has already traveled. Thus, even this seasoned wanderer would be unable to find its way back from a place it hadn't reached on its own. Alright, so far we've got this. Ants can see and sense the ultraviolet spectrum, but can they hear? When tackling this question, I thought, well, surely everything about ants must be known. How they hear and with what they hear. But it turned out that's not the case at all. For myrmecologists, that's what an ant specialists are called. I'm not sure if I pronounced it correct, but only one thing is certain. Ants can communicate through sounds. And if that's the case, then they definitely have hearing and organs that with some flexibility in definition can be called ears. And there are several types of these ears. Hearing is far from their only function, and they aren't located only on their head, but also, let's take step by step. As we know, sounds can travel not only through air, but also through liquids, like water, and even solid objects, like soil, tree trunks, and leaves. While airborne sounds are most important for humans, for ants, who spend their entire lives crawling on the ground, trees, solid sounds hold enormous significance. Humans, in principle, can also hear solid substrate sounds. Think of the classic western scene where a cowboy puts his ear to the railroad tracks to feel for the vibration of the approaching train. Like ants sensing vibration through solid surfaces, he's using the ground to hear what's coming his way. To detect these solid sounds, ants need to perceive vibrations, and 2 ears on the head aren't enough for this. Hearing organs need to be located wherever the body contracts a sounding surface, essentially all over the body. These organs don't look anything like human ears, or say those of a rabbit. Since they don't need to detect airborne waves, there is no need for an internal receiver, like the ear structure we're used to. Instead, these hearing organs consist of specialized strings called scoloppedia, stretched between the external skeleton and a flexible membrane. When the surface an ant touches begins to vibrate, the cuticle pulls to the scalpedium. As the scalpedium stretches, the nerve cell is stimulated by the tension and sends an impulse to the corresponding nerve center. This is how surface vibrations are converted into nerve impulses, allowing the ant to hear the sound. Ants are incredibly strong for their size, are great at carrying things not only because of their strength, but also because they can find advantageous routes. In this cave, ants are trying to carry a large silicone ring through a maze with randomly placed obstacles. It's a bit like pinball, where the ring replaces the ball and the ants replace gravity. It seems like the ants should bump into random pathways, but in reality, they choose nearly optimal routes. This is all thanks to the little scouts that circle around the ring and checks all possible routes in advance, so the workers with the ring in their mandibles can immediately take the best path. The more complex the maze, the better the ants perform. Have you ever heard about leafcutter ants? The man in the video is named Paul Rosalie, and he is dedicated to protecting the Amazon rainforest, going on expeditions and studying nature. He stopped at a campsite in the wrong place but found out too late. His tent was attacked by leafcutter ants, and as the name suggests, they started cutting through the fabric, and they do it very efficiently. These ants can, for example, cut leaves from an entire orange tree in just 24 hours. After the ant attack, the tent stopped providing any protection for Paul against the various fauna of the jungle, so he couldn't sleep that night. Plus, the ants even tried to bite off and take away his ear, which is not a pleasant situation. So back to our main topic. Unfortunately, the fate of an ant that drifted away on a boat or flew far from the anthill on a leaf would be quite sad. Even if it tries to navigate by the sky, it will never be able to find its way back to the nest. The only consolation is that this ant won't suffer for long. As anyone who in childhood like me tried to keep ants in jar alone knows, social insects cope poorly in separation with their colony, and even with suitable food, they die within a few days. Experiments shows that when alone, an ant simply doesn't know what to do with itself. It remains in a constant state of anxiety, moving back and forth continuously, which leads to high energy expenditure. Interesting, if an ant is separated from the colony with a few companions, it feels much better than just being alone. For example, an ant alone can live up to 6 days, while in a group of 10 individuals, its lifespan increased to 66 days, which is 10 times longer. So while an ant might be lost without its colony, its story reminds us of incredible power of community and teamwork in nature. Even the smallest creature survives by relying on each other in the ways that are both complex and beautiful. Ants may seem very small, but their world is truly vast and remarkable. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed exploring the hidden world of ants, don't forget to like, subscribe and hit the button for more fascinating discoveries. See you next time.